You wake up in the morning and the first thing you hear is criticism. Not just criticism, it's visceral, it's personal, it's designed to make you doubt yourself. And you know what I realized? Over decades of doing this, building things, taking risks that others wouldn't take, apology is a trap, not because I'm incapable of recognizing mistakes. I'm not. I see them clearly. I see them sometimes before anyone else does. But I learned something that most people never understand. There's a profound difference between acknowledging reality and apologizing for it. An apology isn't just words. It's a surrender of your position. It's a public admission that you were wrong, that your instinct was flawed, that your confidence was misplaced. And the moment you do that, the moment you step back and say those words with sincerity, with genuine contrition, something shifts in how people perceive you. They don't forgive you and move on. They remember that moment of weakness, they file it away, and they use it. I've watched this happen my entire life. A man apologizes for a decision, and suddenly that decision becomes the lens through which everyone views him. He's the guy who backed down. He's the guy who doubted himself. He's the guy who could be broken. Once that narrative takes hold, it's almost impossible to rebuild what you've lost. Your authority isn't just diminished, it's fundamentally altered. People stop believing in you the same way. Conviction is fragile. Most people don't understand how fragile it is. You can build it over years, carefully, through consistent action, through standing firm when everything around you is screaming at you to capitulate. You can establish yourself as someone who believes in what he believes in, someone who won't be shaken, someone whose word means something because his position means something. But apology, sincere apology, fractures all of that. It sends a signal to the world that your convictions are negotiable. And if your convictions are negotiable, then what exactly are people believing in? I think about the moments when people wanted me to apologize most, the moments when the pressure was immense, when good people around me were saying, this would be easier if you just apologized. And I understand their logic. Apologize, take the hit, and then move forward. The storm passes. But I always thought deeper than that. An apology isn't an end point. It's a beginning. It's the beginning of a new narrative where you're defined by your concession, not your conviction. There's something almost hypnotic about how the modern world wants apologies. It's become currency. Everyone's apologizing for everything. Politicians apologize for things they didn't do. Celebrities craft elaborate apology statements, workshopped by teams of publicists, designed to seem genuine while being completely calculated. The apology has become so common, so cheap, that it's almost meaningless. When everyone apologizes, no one's apology matters. It's just noise. It's just part of the rhythm of damage control. But that's not why I don't apologize. It's deeper than that. I don't apologize because I've spent my life making decisions based on what I believe to be true in that moment. Sometimes those decisions were controversial. Sometimes they were unpopular. Sometimes they turned out differently than I expected. But here's what I know. Every single one of those decisions came from somewhere real. They came from my analysis of a situation, from my instinct about what needed to happen, from my conviction about what was right. To apologize for those decisions would be to suggest that I should have ignored that instinct, that I should have cared more about optics than about what I actually believed. You can hear the difference in a room, the difference between a man who's truly certain and a man who's playing a role. There's a confidence that comes from alignment when what you're saying matches what you actually believe. When your actions and your convictions are moving in the same direction, people respond to that. They can feel it. It's like a frequency they recognize, even if they don't consciously understand it. But the moment you apologize, the moment you say something you don't entirely believe, something that's designed to placate rather than to speak truth, that frequency changes. People sense it. The power drains out of the moment. I'm not talking about arrogance here. This isn't about ego, though people love to reduce it to that. This is about integrity in a specific sense. It's about the integrity of standing by your own judgment. We live in a time where everyone's constantly looking for permission to change their minds, constantly seeking validation for their choices from external sources. They want to be told they're right, and when they're told they're wrong, they experience it as a profound threat. So they apologize to make the threat go away. But think about what you're actually doing when you do that. You're teaching people that your convictions can be purchased with social pressure. You're teaching them that if they apply enough force, you'll break. You're demonstrating that your beliefs aren't actually central to who you are. They're just surface positions that you'll abandon when the cost gets too high. That's a dangerous lesson to teach anyone about yourself. I've had people apologize to me over the years, people I respected, and I've watched what happens after. They're never quite the same. There's a subtle shift in the dynamic. They're more careful. They're less willing to take risks. They're constantly managing their image instead of focusing their energy on what they're trying to build. The act of apology opens a door to self-consciousness that's very hard to close. You become aware of how you're being perceived in a way that fundamentally changes how you operate. The pressure to apologize comes from a particular kind of fear. It's the fear of being misunderstood, of being judged harshly, of having your legacy damaged by a single decision or statement. And I understand that fear. It's real. But I made a choice early in my life that I wouldn't let that fear dictate my actions. If I made a decision, I owned it. If it turned out differently than expected, I learned from it and moved forward. But I wouldn't abdicate responsibility for my own judgment by seeking forgiveness from the court of public opinion. There's a freedom in that, a genuine freedom that most people never experience, because most people are perpetually seeking absolution. They're looking for the moment when they can be told that they're okay, that they're forgiven, that they can move forward unburdened. But that moment never quite comes, because there's always something else, always another controversy, another offense, another reason to apologize. It's an endless cycle of contrition and temporary relief. I chose a different path. I chose to be responsible for my own judgment, which means accepting the consequences of that judgment. It means understanding that not everyone will agree with me, that some people will hate what I did or what I said, and that no apology I could offer would change their minds anyway. Once you accept that, once you really internalize it, you become free to act according to your own analysis rather than according to what you think will be most palatable. There's a kind of power in that, the power of a man who has nothing left to lose because he's already surrendered the thing that most people cling to most fiercely, the approval of others. Not that I don't care what people think. I do. I'm interested in truth, in impact, in legacy. But I've learned to care about those things in a way that's disconnected from the need to be forgiven or validated. When you stop seeking apologies, inverse forgiveness, you start to understand who you actually are beneath all the noise. You start to see your convictions clearly without the distortion of how they might be perceived. And you can make adjustments from that place of clarity rather than from a place of desperation to be liked. I think about the moments when people wanted me to apologize most, the moments when the pressure was immense, when good people around me were saying, this would be easier if you just apologized. And I understand their logic. Apologize, take the hit, and then move forward. The storm passes. But I always thought deeper than that. An apology isn't an end point, it's a beginning. It's the beginning of a new narrative where you're defined by your concession, not your conviction. You learn this early if you pay attention. You learn it by watching other people fail. You watch a man make a strong decision, and the moment criticism comes, he folds, he second guesses himself, he looks for the exit, and you see it happen in real time the moment his certainty becomes uncertainty, the moment he transforms from a leader into someone who's managed, and nobody respects that. They might forgive it, they might sympathize with it, but respect, that's different. Respect is reserved for people who stay true to their own judgment, even when it costs them something. I've been through things that most people will never experience. Times when the entire establishment was aligned against me. Times when I could feel the momentum building, the media, the critics, the doubters, all moving in the same direction, all pointing at the same target, which was me. And in those moments, you have a choice. You can read the room and adjust. You can sense the direction the wind is blowing and move with it. You can apologize and try to regain some ground, or you can stand still and let the wind blow around you. The thing about standing still is that it feels longer than it actually is. Time distorts when you're under that kind of pressure. A week feels like a month feels like a year. But here's what I discovered. The storm always passes, always. The moment that felt like it would define you forever, the controversy that seemed like it would be brought up forever, it eventually fades into the background. New controversies emerge, new targets present themselves, the news cycle moves on. But the people who stood firm, the people who didn't apologize, who didn't bend, who maintained their position, those people remain standing when the dust clears. The people who apologize, though, they're left in a different position. They've already conceded the high ground. They've already admitted that the criticism had weight, that there was something to forgive. So even after the apology, even after the cycle moves on, that narrative remains. The narrative of a man who could be broken, the narrative of a man whose convictions were negotiable, that sticks with you in a way that the original controversy doesn't. I learned something else too. I learned that most criticism isn't actually about what you did, it's about who you are. It's about the fact that you exist in a certain way, that you've positioned yourself in a certain way, that you represent something that makes other people uncomfortable. Those people will find reasons to criticize you, and if you apologize for one thing, they won't accept it and move on. They'll use it as evidence that you're vulnerable, and they'll attack again, harder, looking for the next weakness. Apology teaches them that you can be wounded. It teaches them how to wound you. So I decided early on that I would accept the criticism without accepting its premise. I would listen to what people were saying without letting it determine my next move. I would maintain my position not because I was incapable of growth or change, but because growth and change shouldn't come from external pressure. They should come from internal recognition. They should come from your own analysis, not from the threat of social or professional consequence. This is a hard distinction for people to understand because we live in a culture that's obsessed with apology. We've turned it into a moral requirement. If you've hurt someone, if you've made someone uncomfortable, if you've said something that doesn't align with current understanding, you're expected to apologize. It's treated as the baseline of morality, but I've come to understand that there's something deeper than apology. There's the act of taking responsibility for your own judgment. There's the act of being clear about why you did, what you understood at the time, and what you've learned since. That's different from apology that's actually honest. When you apologize, you're often performing a ritual. You're going through the motions of contrition because the cultural moment demands it, but you haven't necessarily changed your mind. You haven't necessarily learned anything. You've just decided that the cost of standing firm was too high, versus when you maintain your position and explain your reasoning, you're inviting people into your actual thought process. You're not asking for forgiveness. You're offering clarity. And people respond to that differently. it's harder for them to attack clarity than it is to attack contrition, because contrition invites exploitation. I've watched people I respect get caught in the apology cycle. They apologize for something, and it feels like relief for a moment, but then they realize that the relief is temporary. The apology doesn't actually change how people perceive them. It just gives people a different lens through which to view them now. They're not just controversial, they're also weak enough to be broken. They've added a new layer to their reputation, and from that point forward, they're constantly managing that layer, trying to rehabilitate that image, trying to prove that they're not actually weak, even though they've already demonstrated that they are. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes with that. The exhaustion of constantly trying to rehabilitate your image, of being perpetually aware of how you're being perceived, of adjusting your message to try to recover lost ground. I decided I wouldn't live like that. I decided that I would be who I am, that I would do what I believe is right, and that I would accept the consequences of that choice. Some people would hate me for it. Some people would never understand my reasoning. Some people would use my decisions against me, but at least I would be authentic. At least I would be whole, and that wholeness matters more than you might think, because people can sense when you're fractured, when you're trying to be multiple things to multiple people, when you're constantly managing different versions of yourself for different audiences. They can feel that fragmentation, and it undermines everything you're trying to accomplish. Whereas when you're whole, when you're integrated, when your public and private self are fundamentally aligned, people feel that too. They might not like it, they might disagree with it, but they respect it in a way that they can't respect someone who's constantly apologizing for the gap between who they claim to be and who they actually are. I think about what it means to have conviction in the modern world. Conviction is almost countercultural now. Everyone's supposed to be constantly evolving, constantly revising their positions, constantly open to being told they're wrong, and evolution and growth are good things. But there's a difference between genuine evolution and the performance of evolution. There's a difference between actually changing your mind because you've learned something new and apologizing just because the social pressure to do so has become unbearable. When I've changed my mind about things, and I have, it's been because I encountered new information that was compelling, or because my circumstances changed in a way that required a different approach, or because I was actually persuaded through genuine engagement with an idea. It wasn't because I was being attacked and I needed the attack to stop. That's an important distinction, because the moment your position changes become a response to social pressure, you've lost your independence. You've become reactive instead of active. You've become a follower instead of a leader. There's something people don't talk about enough, and it's this. Criticism is a test. Every single time someone comes at you with an attack, every time they're trying to make you doubt yourself, they're testing to see if you're actually committed to what you're saying. And most people fail that test. They fail it because they haven't built a strong enough internal foundation. They haven't developed the emotional discipline to distinguish between an attack that's designed to wound them and an attack that's just noise. So they respond to the attack instead of to the truth. They defend their position instead of standing by it. They apologize instead of explaining. I learned very early that the people who are loudest, who are most insistent, who are most dedicated to making you feel bad about yourself, those people are often the ones with the least actual power. They have rhetorical power. They have the power of numbers, the power of repetition, the power of coordinated messaging, but they don't have the power to actually change who you are unless you give it to them. And the moment you start apologizing, the moment you start trying to convince them that you're actually a good person, the moment you start seeking their approval, that's when you've given them the power. I developed a certain kind of emotional discipline around this. I learned to feel the criticism without absorbing it. You can listen to what someone's saying. You can understand their perspective. You can even acknowledge that they have a right to their perspective. but you don't have to accept the premise that they're right about you. You don't have to integrate their judgment into your self-image. You can hold it at arm's length and examine it rationally, asking yourself, is this true? Is this relevant? Does this change how I understand myself or my decisions? Usually the answer is no. Usually they're attacking the image they've constructed of you, not the actual reality of who you are. Most people confuse these things. They think that if enough people believe something about them, it must be true. They think that if they're being widely criticized, they must have done something wrong. But that's not how reality works. Reality is independent of consensus. Truth is independent of opinion. And who you actually are is independent of what people think about you. This is hard to internalize in a world that's constantly trying to convince you otherwise, but it's essential. Because the moment you start letting public opinion determine your sense of self, you've lost your center. You're no longer operating from an internal locus of control. You're operating from an external one. You're constantly looking outside yourself to figure out who you are. I've watched people get trapped in that pattern. They make a mistake or they make a controversial decision, and immediately they're looking outward to see how it's being received. Are people upset? How upset? Is it the kind of upset that will go away or the kind that will linger? And they're already thinking about how to fix it, how to manage it, how to apologize for it before anyone even really understands what happened. They're in reactive mode from the very beginning, and that reactive mode never ends. It just becomes the way they operate. They're always managing, always adjusting, always trying to be whoever they think people want them to be. That's exhausting, not just mentally, but spiritually. It's an exhaustion that sits in your bones. It's the exhaustion of living inauthentically, of constantly performing a version of yourself that isn't quite real. And I made a decision very early that I wouldn't live like that. I would be who I am. If people didn't like it, they didn't like it. If people attacked me for it, they attacked me. But at least I would be whole. At least I would be integrated. At least when I laid my head down at night, I wouldn't have to wonder who I was. I would know. There's a particular kind of peace that comes from that. Not the peace of being liked by everyone. I've never had that, and I never expected to. But the peace of being sure, the peace of knowing that your words and your actions are coming from the same place. The peace of understanding that if someone's attacking you, they're attacking a real thing, not a carefully constructed image. That peace is worth more than approval. It's worth more than comfort. It's worth more than the temporary relief that comes from a successful apology. I think about the moments when I've been most tested, when the pressure to apologize has been most intense, and I realize that those moments were actually moments of clarity. Because when you're under that kind of pressure, you can't hide anymore. You can't pretend. You have to decide very clearly what you actually believe and whether you're willing to stand by it. And every single time I've been faced with that choice, every single time I've had the opportunity to apologize and move on, I've chosen instead to stand, and I've never regretted it, not once. Because standing is always harder than apologizing in the moment, but it's easier in the long term. The regret is much worse on the other side. What I've learned is that emotional control isn't about suppressing your feelings. It's not about being cold or disconnected. It's about being clear about what you're feeling and not letting that feeling determine your response. When you're being attacked, you feel it. You feel the sting. You feel the anger. You feel the frustration. All of that is real, but you don't have to act on it. You don't have to let it dictate your next move. You can feel it and simultaneously recognize it as something that's happening to you, not something that defines you or requires a particular response from you. This is different from the way most people experience emotion. Most people experience an emotion and immediately assume that they need to respond to it. They feel attacked, so they apologize. They feel guilty, so they confess. They feel uncomfortable, so they try to fix it. But there's a gap between feeling something and needing to act on it. It's a small gap, but it's essential. It's the gap where freedom lives. It's the gap where you can choose how you want to respond rather than just reacting automatically. I developed this through practice. You don't just wake up one day with emotional discipline. You build it. You build it by being in situations where you're tempted to react and choosing not to. You build it by recognizing patterns in your own behavior and consciously choosing to interrupt those patterns. You build it by sitting with discomfort instead of immediately trying to eliminate it. And over time, you develop a kind of equanimity. Things still bother you, but they don't derail you. There's something about getting older that helps with this too. You've lived through enough cycles of criticism and vindication that you start to see the pattern. The thing that everyone said would destroy you didn't destroy you. The apology you didn't give didn't cause the catastrophe people predicted. The time you stood firm, despite everyone telling you to back down, turned out to be the right move. After you've seen that pattern repeat enough times, it becomes harder to doubt yourself. It becomes easier to trust your own judgment, but you have to be willing to go through it. You have to be willing to be misunderstood. You have to be willing to be disliked. You have to be willing to be attacked. You have to be willing to stand alone if that's what it takes. And most people aren't willing to do that. Most people value comfort and approval too much. They value being liked. They value being seen as good. And so they apologize and they compromise and they become smaller versions of themselves. And they tell themselves that it's because they're more evolved, more humble, more self-aware. But usually it's just because they're more afraid. Fear is at the root of most apologies, not the fear of being wrong. That's a different thing. But the fear of being seen as wrong, the fear of being judged, the fear of being alone, the fear of being excluded from the group. These fears are real. They're deep. They go back to childhood, to the ways we learn to survive by being liked and accepted. But they're also something that can be transcended, not eliminated. You don't eliminate fundamental human drives, but transcended, placed in their proper context, understood without being controlled by them. I made a decision that I would transcend the fear of being disliked, not because I don't care what people think. I care deeply about impact, about being understood, about legacy, but because I understood that the fear was trying to run my life. It was trying to determine my decisions, and I decided that I wouldn't let it. I decided that I would do what I thought was right, and then I would accept whatever consequences came from that. Some people would love me for it. Some people would hate me for it, but at least it would be real. At least I would be making decisions based on my own judgment rather than based on fear of judgment. What I've come to understand is that your identity is something you have to protect, not in an aggressive way, but in the way you protect something precious. It's something that can be eroded if you're not careful. It can be compromised if you keep surrendering pieces of it to placate people or to escape criticism. Every time you apologize for something you don't actually believe you did wrong, you're giving away a piece of your identity. You're saying that what other people think about you matters more than what you know about yourself. And over time, if you do that enough, you start to lose track of who you actually are. You become a collection of apologies instead of a person. I've been in rooms with people who've gotten so lost in that, so committed to managing how they're perceived that they don't even know what they actually think anymore. They know what they're supposed to think. They know what's fashionable to think. They know what won't get them attacked. But ask them what they actually believe in the privacy of their own mind, and sometimes they can't answer. They've spent so long being what other people want them to be that the authentic version of them has almost disappeared. That's a tragedy. That's a kind of slow death that nobody talks about. I decided very early that I wouldn't let that happen to me. I decided that my identity, the core sense of who I am and what I believe, would be non-negotiable, not rigid, not incapable of growth or change, but rooted in something solid, something that isn't constantly shifting based on social winds. And I built that identity through consistent action, through making decisions, through standing by those decisions, through being willing to be criticized for them and not crumbling when the criticism came. This is what people don't understand about conviction. They think it's about being stubborn or closed-minded, but it's actually about being grounded. It's about having such a clear sense of who you are that external forces can't shake you. You can listen to criticism, you can evaluate it, you can even learn from it, but it doesn't fundamentally alter your sense of self. You're not dependent on external validation to know who you are. You know it from the inside. And this becomes incredibly important when you're in a position where you make decisions that affect other people, because there's always going to be someone who doesn't like those decisions. There's always going to be someone who's hurt by them or angered by them. And if you're dependent on their approval, if you need them to forgive you in order to feel like a good person, then you're never going to make the hard decisions that need to be made. You're going to be paralyzed by the fear of causing offense or creating disappointment. But real leadership, real responsibility sometimes requires making decisions that people won't like. It requires prioritizing what you believe is right over what you believe will make people happy with you. And you can only do that if you have an internal sense of legitimacy. If you know at a fundamental level that you're trying to do the right thing, even if not everyone sees it that way, that knowledge has to come from inside you. It can't come from external sources. It can't come from apologies or explanations or public relations campaigns. It has to be something you've built yourself through consistency and integrity. I think about the different ways people respond to being in positions of power or influence. Some people use it as an opportunity to finally be approved of. They think, now that I'm powerful, now that I have status, finally people will like me, and they spend that power trying to be liked. They make decisions designed to be popular rather than designed to be right, and eventually people sense that. They sense that you're more interested in being loved than in doing what's actually necessary, and respect drains away. Other people use power as an opportunity to dominate. They think, now I have power, so I can finally make people do what I want. And there's a kind of satisfaction in that, at least temporarily, but it's a hollow satisfaction because it's still dependent on external things. It's still dependent on you having power. The moment that power is gone, the moment people don't have to do what you say anymore, the whole thing collapses. There's no internal strength holding it up. But then there are people who use power as an opportunity to be more genuinely themselves. They think, now that I have a platform, now that I have influence, I can actually say what I believe and let the chips fall where they may. They're willing to lose followers, to lose allies, to lose status, rather than compromise who they are. And what's interesting is that over time, that kind of person usually gains more respect and more genuine influence than the people who are constantly trying to be liked or constantly trying to dominate, because people sense authenticity. People sense when someone actually believes what they're saying versus when they're just performing. The refusal to apologize is, in a way, an assertion of that authenticity. It's saying, I stand behind what I did. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not trying to rehabilitate my image. I'm just telling you who I am and what I believe. Some people will respect that. Some people will hate it, but everyone will feel that it's real. And there's something powerful in that. There's something that can't be taken away from you because it's not dependent on anyone else's opinion. I've noticed that people who refuse to apologize get treated differently than people who constantly apologize. The people who constantly apologize get attacked more, not less, because they've established that they can be broken. They've established that if you apply enough social pressure, you can make them do what you want. So people keep applying that pressure. They keep finding new things to be offended by. They keep finding new reasons to demand an apology. It becomes a game, and the person who's apologizing can never win because the goalposts keep moving. But the person who refuses to apologize, they get attacked too, but it's different. The attacks are more about trying to convince other people that the person is bad rather than trying to make the person themselves feel bad, because that person has made it clear that their feelings don't matter. They can't be wounded by criticism because they've made it clear that criticism doesn't penetrate them, so people eventually give up trying to wound them. They just accept that this is a person who's not going to be broken, and they adjust their strategy accordingly. You can see this in how different people handle controversy. Some people immediately jump into damage control mode. They're trying to understand what went wrong, how to fix it, how to make people stop being angry. They're in a state of anxiety and reactivity. Other people just keep moving forward. They acknowledge what happened. They explain their reasoning if they want to, but they don't treat it as a crisis. They don't treat it as something that requires an emergency response. They just incorporate it into their larger narrative and move on. And you watch which person retains their authority and which person loses it. It's the person who doesn't panic. It's the person who doesn't treat criticism as a threat to their very existence. That's because criticism isn't actually a threat to your existence. If your existence isn't dependent on people's approval of you, you exist. You have agency. You have the ability to make decisions and live with the consequences. That's real. That's solid. That can't be taken away from you. Criticism is just noise. It's just people expressing displeasure. And yes, if enough people express displeasure, it might have practical consequences. It might affect your career or your relationships. I'm not naive about that, but it won't affect who you are. It won't affect your sense of self unless you let it. And the refusal to apologize is a way of not letting it. It's a way of drawing a line and saying, this is who I am. This is what I did. I'm not going to pretend to be sorry about it if I'm not actually sorry about it. That might make people angry, but it also makes them respect you, even if they don't like you. And respect is worth more than approval. Respect is what gives you power. Respect is what makes people listen to you, even when they disagree with you. Approval is just comfort. It's nice, but it's ultimately empty.